Now, let us organize this as an interactive session. I intend to speak initially for about half an hour, and then let us discuss. Initially, my intention was to talk on human rights, peace, and security, and use examples from South Sudan and Ukraine. However, please feel encouraged to raise any other human rights issues or country situations you may be interested in. Let me first put human rights, peace, and security in a broader context. United Nations as organization is based on 3 pillars. It is peace and security, development, and human rights. And as an illustration, I would quote former Secretary General Kofi Annan, who wanted to emphasize how much these 3 pillars are interrelated, saying that there is no peace without development. There is no development without peace, and there is neither without human rights. Let me use just some brief illustrations of that. There is no peace without development. There was an interesting research which was taking into account development data and data about conflicts, and it was striking that conflicts were usually taking place in countries and societies which for certain number of years were having stagnating or negative development. So the correlation, simply numerically, is very high. Now, second thing that I mention is that there is no development without peace. And there were many researchers in this area. And they were clearly indicating that each year of conflict sets country back for about a decade. Of course, there would be tremendous differences because of different intensity of conflict, different targeting of infrastructure, different levels of destructions. However, there is no doubt about highly negative impact of conflict on development. And it's not only destruction of housing capacities, of infrastructure, there are indirect damages. For example, I can say from my own country, Croatia, where I was a law school professor, I acknowledge that after the conflict, for a couple of years or even longer, we had decreased academic standards in our institutions, simply because you do have understanding for young people who were affected by the conflict, who participate in the army or were displaced. And you, without any deliberate decision, you decrease academic standards. So what are the effects of decreasing academic standards on development? Of course, it's not easy to calculate them, but they are far-reaching as well. And let me end this up by third part of Annan's quotation, that there is neither peace nor development without human rights. So I would use 2 practical examples. First, let me use the development one. If you discriminate a part of your population, if women are not treated equally, if they do not have education opportunities, or if they do not have employment opportunities, you are not using 50% of your human resources. When I was, as Dean kindly mentioned, President of Economic and Social Council in 2002, I was together with well-known economist Jeffrey Sachs, we were trying to identify where invested dollar in development pays back best. And after a lot of research, it was education of girl children. Why? Because it had a multiplying effect. If mothers are educated, their children, there is high correlation and likelihood that they will be educated as well. In a household where mothers are educated, children were usually much healthier because of their better knowledge how to protect them. There was also a considerably higher income in such situations. Now, let me, after this broader picture, turn to the essence of our discussion today, and it's human rights, peace and security. Human rights are extremely relevant for all three phases of a conflict cycle. Quite often, human rights are roots, and human rights violations are roots of conflicts all over the world. Let me use as an example Arab Spring and the picture that was extremely telling. It was broadcast all over the world. A picture of a protester carrying a banner, a very simple banner, saying, "I am a man," nothing more. This short message has a lot of underlying meaning that is deeply human rights based. I am a man, but my rights are not being respected. I am a man, and I'm entitled to choose my political leaders, but I'm not enabled to do so. I'm entitled to fair share of profit from natural resources of my country. I'm entitled to justice without the need to bribe the judge. I'm entitled to have health service and education for my family without the need to bribe anyone. And I have nothing. So, to quite an extent, Arab Spring was motivated by a situation where people all over the world are becoming more aware of their entitlement to certain human rights. And if those human rights are not being acknowledged, sooner or later, there will be a rebellion. About outcomes of Arab Spring, we can discuss if you are interested later. Now, let me move to the second phase of conflict cycle. When we do have actual conflict going on, human rights are quite often being systematically violated in sense of war crimes, various violations of international humanitarian law, crimes against humanity. We speak about crimes against humanity if war crimes committed and human rights violations committed are being widespread or systematic. Or even we can speak about genocide when there is an intent to exterminate a group as such. Now, what do we do? What, for example, Human Rights Office does in the conflict situation trying to protect human rights? We monitor and we report. We monitor human rights violations and we publicly report on violations that are taking place. For example, when a conflict in Ukraine started, it took us not more than 10 days from the beginning of conflict to establish a monitoring mission in Ukraine, which was publishing on a monthly basis reports. So what's the use of those reports? With impartial reporting on human rights violations, what you achieve is that there is more limited space to manipulation, to propaganda on what's really going on in the country. And I'll use here another example during my relatively recent visit in South Sudan, when talking to representatives of two ethnic groups, Nuers and Dinkas, not speaking to military or political leaders, but common people, including victims. Their narratives, their understanding, their perception was completely different. Each of those groups was honestly convinced that conflict was started by the other groups and that they are victims and the other side are perpetrators. So why is our reporting so essential? Because you are having somebody impartial who will report and who will help to establish facts. And without establishing facts, you cannot have clarity on what's going on, and it's much more difficult to end the conflict. And finally, this leads us to the last part of the conflict cycle, to the post-conflict situation. In most conflicts, you have winners and you have losers. And if winners discriminate against losers, if there is a so-called victor's justice, if just one side is being prosecuted for alleged crimes committed, you are sowing seeds for another conflict. And it won't take long before you face another phase of bloodshed. So it is also crucially important to ensure that there is accountability for crimes committed, no matter who is perpetrator and who were the victims. And of course, there is always that dilemma that is being raised between peace and accountability, because always it is easier to end conflict by proclaiming amnesties. And our position is that amnesties in general are good, but they should not cover worse crimes such as killings and rapes. Because if you do that, it does facilitate ending immediate conflict. But it quite often, if not addressed, leads to some future confrontations. And if you want to have sustainable peace, you must get involved in accountability process. It may take time, but it's necessary to ensure that the peace will be a sustainable one. And again, let us use the example of South Sudan. In that country, there were decades of conflict and the decades of war crimes being committed during those conflicts. They were never addressed. There was never accountability. And quite a lot of analysts and observers think that it's one of the reasons why we had last round of conflict and last round of victims. So there is a strong push by the Security Council to ensure that this time there is accountability to ensure that conflict does not reoccur. And let me finalize this introduction with some trends, with some new initiatives that are emerging in the United Nations. I would say that there is no doubt that there is growing awareness that human rights are relevant for peace and security. And I will use illustrations that will indicate that it's a position of Secretary General of the Secretariat of the United Nations, as well as of member states. I recently returned from Turin in Italy, where Secretary General had his yearly retreat with his most senior advisors. So it's some 50 most senior people in the United Nations system. I attended a very similar retreat in 2010, and it was in Alpbach in Austria. And during that retreat in 2010, there was a discussion, and I will not be mentioning names, where one senior advisor has raised the issue of human rights, saying, why you people have to mention human rights? Many member states feel reluctant when they hear about human rights. Can you change the language and speak about something else? You will be much more effective. Now, just 5 years later, there wasn't a single senior advisor who was not emphasizing the importance of human rights. Some of them probably because they felt that they were expected to say that, but at least if not genuine, they felt obliged to do it. And when discussing Secretary General's legacy, in fact, it was identified that human rights are his most important legacy, especially when related to peace and security, including also empowerment of women and women's rights. And again, I won't quote names, but it was one senior advisor who said, and who would expect that a 70 years old Asian would be champion of human rights and women's rights. And let me now, after speaking about Secretariat and human rights, raise the issue of member states, Security Council. It is not just impression. I can give some quantitative indicators of trends. Between 1993, when Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights was established, until 2010, we have briefed Security Council on 15 occasions on human rights violations which are relevant for peace and security. So in 17 years, 15 times, less than once in a year. Now, in 2014 alone, we have briefed Security Council 15 times, which means more often than once a month. And this trend of interest of the Security Council for human rights relevant information when deciding about peace and security continues to increase. Of course, there are differences. Sometimes it was even voted upon. And as you may know, in substantive decisions, you have to have a consensus of P5, but for procedural decisions, such as putting something on the agenda of the Security Council, it's enough to have majority of 9 to 6 votes. So sometimes some countries were opposing to receiving human rights briefing, but under the threat of vote or after the vote, human rights information has been shared. And now let me address those new initiatives that are deeply rooted in human rights and have a linkage with peace and security. First of them is so-called human rights due diligence policy. It is a policy of Secretary General that when supporting non-United Nations security forces, we can do that only if those security forces are observing human rights. Now, let me simplify the whole thing. What are non-UN security forces? For example, if we have our forces in Democratic Republic of Congo, or if we have them in South Sudan, our support to non-UN security forces is support for national forces of DRC or South Sudan. Is it police? Is it migration authorities? Is it intelligence service? Or is it army? It doesn't make a difference. It's all security forces. And if they want United Nations to support these forces, they have to respect human rights. Now, what does that practically mean? In Democratic Republic of Congo, we do support national security forces a lot. We support them by providing them uniforms, sometimes by feeding them, by providing them gasoline, by transporting them, or sometimes even supporting them in their military operations. So what does implementation of human rights due diligence policy mean? It means that before involving in support of non-UN security forces, we need to make a risk assessment. Risk assessment where the forces that we are supporting will be involved in human rights violations. If we assess that they will be involved in human rights violations, we cannot support them. But the whole idea is not to cut the list of forces that we are supporting shorter, but to influence their behavior. So what we tell them, we cannot support you as we did recently. You might have seen that we were unable to support the forces of DRC in one of military campaigns because we said that two commanders that were in charge of operations had an extremely poor human rights record. Their units have been previously involved in some killings of civilians and rapes, and we said that under these conditions we cannot support them. But we also said, if you introduce certain mitigating measures to prevent human rights violations, we would be able to support you. So if you exchange those two commanders with people who have human rights clean record, if you also ensure that with the military force there would be some observers who would observe that human rights are being respected, we will be able to support you. Now, another policy, and you will be surprised to hear that so far it was not taking place, is human rights screening. So all United Nations staff, being civilian staff, or if we deal with peacekeepers, now has to have clean human rights record. Previously, it was enough that you were not a convicted criminal and that there was no criminal proceeding against you. Otherwise, you could apply and be admitted to the United Nations. Now, what we request in addition to that is that people who want to be under the United Nations flag have to have a clear human rights record. So, for example, when my contract was extended a year ago, I had to sign an affidavit that I was not involved in human rights violations. The same applies to all other United Nations staff, and the same applies to peacekeepers. When a country is sending peacekeepers, it has to guarantee that all members of their contingent, that neither of them has been involved in grave human rights violations. Now, of course, affidavits may not be sufficient, and now we are in the middle of a pilot project where we are doing background checks. We do not have sufficient information, sufficient staff to check literally everyone, but we are checking top officials. For example, my-level UN officials are having background checks, whether they do or do not have a clean human rights background. The same applies to military commanders. And some candidates for military commanders were unpleasantly surprised that they were refused because they had some dark parts of their careers. And let me finalize this with the most important, most promising, newest, and I would say the most far-reaching of those policies, and it's called Human Rights Upfront Policy. The idea is that violations of human rights are early warnings of potential mass atrocities. Human rights are, in a way, canaries in a coal mine. You know that historically miners were having canaries with them when going to coal mines, because canaries were the first to die when there were some poisonous gases. So when your canary died, you got out of the pit. So the same applies to human rights violations. Human rights violations, especially certain patterns of human rights violations, are an early indicator of potential mass atrocities. Which human rights violations? Primarily the ones that are related to discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religious affiliation, and so on. So the idea of human rights up front is to establish a system of better information gathering from various sources, better and more strategic information analysis, and then early reaction. If there is an indication of a potentially emerging threat to peace and security, we should not be waiting as long as we were waiting until now. We should have better alarm bells, and we should act faster. That means that if there are signs of potential threat to peace and security, member states, should get involved with member state where such a threat exists through bilateral help, through mediation mechanisms, through regional organizations, but also, if necessary, through the Security Council. So the idea is that also UN Secretariat and us as Human Rights Office should not be telling Security Council what they want to hear, nice words, but what they need to know. And what they need to know is sometimes something that they wouldn't like to hear. However, this, however unpleasant may be, can prevent from escalation of conflict, leading finally to mass-scale atrocities. So, thank you very much for your attention, and I stand ready for your questions, comments, whether related to issues that I have raised or whether related to issues I have omitted.